Genesis feels random unless you watch what happens in order. Creation, Eden, Cain, corruption, flood, nations, Babel, Abraham. At first, those look like disconnected stories, but they are not disconnected stories at all. Each one is the next stage on the same collapse. That is the pattern people miss. Genesis begins with order, then shows the order breaking, spreading, hardening, and being judged, until finally, after everything keeps falling apart, Abraham appears. Not as a random new character, but as the beginning of God's answer. So let's put those on the timeline and watch the whole book locked together. Genesis starts with order, not just existence, not just power, but order. God separates light from darkness, water from waters, land from sea. He forms the world, then fills what he forms. Day by day, everything is deliberate, measured, and good. That is where the timeline begins. Because Genesis does not open on a random world. It opens on a world that fits together. Everything has a place. Everything has a purpose. In the center of that order, God places humanity, made in his image, to live under him in the world he made. That is the first detail people miss. This is not just the story of how everything began. It's the establishment of the order everything else is about to break. And once Genesis gives you that pattern, every later event is measured against it. The garden matters because order came first. Rebellion matters because there was something good to rebel against. Judgment matters because the world was not made for chaos. So the timeline begins here, not with collapse, but with perfect order. And that is exactly why what comes next matters. The order does not hold. Eden is where the collapse begins. God gives Adam and Eve a world that is full, good, and ordered, but with one clear boundary. Then the serpent attacks that boundary with a question. Did God really say that? This is the turning point. Because Eden is not just about forbidden fruit. It is about humanity stepping outside God's order and reaching for authority on its own terms. The temptation is not merely to take something, it is to decide for themselves what is good and what is not. That is the detail people miss. This is where the sinner shifts. Trust gives way to self-rule. And once that happens, the whole structure starts to crack. Shame enters, hiding enters, blame enters, even the ground is affected. So the problem is no longer just that a command was broken. Now the disorder is inside humanity itself. And once it enters the human heart, it does not stay in the garden for long. And the disorder does not stay between humanity and God. The next turn in the timeline is Cain and Abel, and this is where the collapse moves into the first family. Two brothers bring offerings before God, but the real tension in the story is not on the altar, it's in Cain's heart. This is where Genesis begins to slow down. Before Cain ever lifts his hand against Abel, God warns him that sin is crouching at the door. In other words, the violence shows up in the field only after it has already taken shape within him. That is the detail people miss. This is not just the first murder. It's the moment rebellion against God becomes violence against another human being. The fracture from Eden now moves sideways. What began as shame and hiding now becomes hatred and bloodshed. So the problem is no longer just that humanity is out of order with God. Now human beings are turning on each other. And if sin reaches the first family this quickly, it will not stay contained there for long. And this is where the pattern breaks open. The next turn in the timeline is the corruption of the world. By the time Genesis reaches generations before the flood, the problem is no longer one garden or one family. It has spread outwardly into the whole earth. That is the shift. Genesis describes a world filled with wickedness, where violence is no longer an occasion and evil is no longer isolated. Whatever questions people have about Nephilim or the sons of God, the point of the section is not mystery, it's escalation. This is where the pattern deepens. What began in Eden has now become atmospheric. Corruption is in the imagination of men, in the direction of society, in the condition of the world itself. This is no longer a few sinful moments scattered across the story. It is the human world bent in the same direction. So judgment is no longer a surprising turn. It is the next necessary one. And that is why the flood does not come out of nowhere. It comes when the collapse has reached the world itself. And this is where the timeline resets. The next turn is the flood, and by this point, Genesis has already shown you why it has to happen. The earth is filled with violence. The collapse is spread everywhere. So when the flood comes, it does not arrive as a random disaster. It arrives as judgment. That is where judgment enters the timeline, because the flood is not just about destruction. It is about God responding to the world that has undone itself. The water covers the earth, and the ordered world from Genesis 1 begins to collapse back into chaos. This is where Genesis stops describing a broken world and starts answering it. This is not simply punishment, it is decreation. The world God formed, filled, and called good is being washed away because humanity has filled it with violence instead. But Genesis does not let the line go dark. Noah remains. The ark remains. Life passes through the judgment. And that matters because the flood looks like the end of the problem, but it is not. It is a reset, not a cure. Once the waters go down, the world begins again. And the same human story begins again with it. That version lands harder. And this is where the timeline widens. Now there is a rise of nations, because after the flood, Genesis does not stay focused on one family for too long. The camera pulls back, people multiply, descendants spread, lands, clans, and nations begin to fill the earth again. That is the move. Because at first, this part of Genesis can feel like a slowdown. Just names, lines, generations, but it is not slowing down at all. It is showing you the world rebuilding after judgment. What Genesis is showing here is bigger than population growth. The flood reset humanity, but it did not remove the human problem. So when Genesis shows the nations rising, it shows more than population growth. It is showing the human world taking shape again. Cultures returns, societies return, the earth fills again. And that matters because multiplication is not the danger. Filling the earth was always part of God's design. The real question is what humanity will do with this new beginning. So this section stands on the edge of another rebellion. The world is spreading again, but the heart of man has not changed. And that is why Babel is next. And this is where the rebellion becomes collective. We have now arrived in Babel, and after the nations begin spreading across the earth, Genesis zooms in on one united human project. The people gather, build a city, and raise a tower upward. On the surface, it looks like strength, order, civilization coming together. But Genesis wants you to hear what they say. Let us make a name for ourselves. That is where the rebellion becomes organized. Because Babel is not just a tower. It is about humanity trying to secure greatness, identity, and unity apart from God. The problem is not the building itself. It is the self-exaltation. The same instinct from Eden has now reached this level of society. This is where the rebellion scales up. Humanity is no longer drifting from God one person at a time. Now it is moving in the same direction together. And that is why God scatters them. Not because cities are evil, but because united pride only hardens the collapse. So Babel is not a random story in the middle of Genesis. It is the final proof that even after judgment, humanity still wants to glorify on its own terms. And once that becomes clear, Abraham stops feeling random too, because after Babel, Genesis is finally ready to show God's answer. And this is where the timeline finally turns, and we finally reached Abraham. And after everything Genesis has shown you, orders broken, violence spreading, the world judged, nations scattered, Babel rising and falling, one man appears. And if you are not watching the pattern, Abraham can feel like a different story. But he is not a different story at all. He is the answer to this one. Because Abraham appears exactly where the collapse leaves the world, scattered, proud, and unable to restore itself. That is why this moment matters so much. At Babel, humanity says, let us make a name for ourselves. But when God calls Abraham, the pattern reverses. Humanity tries to build upward. God begins by calling one man outward. This is where the pattern finally breaks. Genesis is not just introducing a new character here. It is introducing the first clear clear line of rescue. After chapter after chapter of human failure, God does not abandon the story. He answers it with a promise. So Abraham is not an interruption in Genesis. He is the turning point Genesis has been moving toward. And once you see that, the whole book changes. Genesis is not random events stacked together. It is a world falling apart until God begins his answer. And that is why Genesis is not random. Creation, Eden, Cain, corruption, flood, nations, Babel, Abraham. 8 moments, 1 collapse, and then finally the beginning of an answer. What starts as a world ordered by God becomes a world broken by man. Then a world shaped by violence, pride, judgment, until God begins to do something new through one man and one promise. So Abraham is not where Genesis changes subjects. He is where Genesis changes direction. And once you see that, the whole book reads differently. Not like scattered early Bible stories, but like one long pattern of collapse giving way to the first clear sign of rescue.